So now I just want to comment on something I've already read. The focus here, in my opinion, is presence itself. Consciousness is being, is presence itself. I think this is what Heidegger was saying, and I think that Heidegger agrees with Advaita Vedanta as Fasching interprets it here. So, consciousness, it's so often understood as a kind of internal stuff. And even some of Fasching's language, perhaps because he's going with the flow of language. Not that he doesn't know better, but he wants to be understood, so he sort of conforms to the very thing he opposes, just in an attempt to be understood. But consciousness is not this conscious mind, right? That would just be an entity. So the ontological difference is crucial here. Consciousness itself, in the strict sense, is our being aware. So the strongest way to say this is presence. You want to sort of desubjectivize it as much as possible. Now, the word presence, it still suggests a kind of intimacy or immediacy. So in another paper, he says, consciousness is presence for. So the way that the empirical ego is entangled with being, this is something Heidegger goes on about in many different lecture courses. Dasein is exposure, deconcealment, the clearing, unveiling. Consciousness is the presence of the world, right? The presence of every kind of thing. So you get a radical pluralism from this. This is a transcendence of tiresome ingredient ontology. But this is it seems to be a hard point to grasp, right? This is, I would say that Fasching, his view is far from dominant. Even though I agree with Fasching, I think if you try to talk about this stuff, you won't easily feel understood. You could use the word presence. That sounds maybe too abstract. If you invoke the word consciousness, you're going to invoke this Cartesian heritage, this strong tendency today to reify consciousness as a kind of stuff, a kind of mystical clay that psychical entities like qualia are made of. So he says, being experientially present is the mode of actuality of experiences. One could say that experiences have a subjective ontology. They have their being and their forness. Yet forness is actually already too much. It is and it isn't, right? So, like I've been arguing. So we have the presence of the world from a point of view. So the world is from the point of view of the empirical subject. But this empirical subject is in, if we must use that language, is in his consciousness. The consciousness is not in the empirical subject. The empirical subject is in the world from his own point of view. So this world that I live in, my experience is world. And this world that I live in, I live in it in a first person kind of way. The intelligibility of the world is something like my system of beliefs. Perception is perspectival or situated. So this is why we specify the meaning of being as presence, right? This, you might say that what many philosophers in the Western tradition, when they sounded subjectivistic, I think that they had not quite clarified. You have the world itself, but from a point of view. And the from a point of viewness does not imply internality, right? But there's been this habit in Western philosophy to think that from a point of viewness implies that world from perspective, should be reduced to psychical entities within the subject. But the subject is definitely in the shared world. So intersubjectivity is tacitly presupposed by all rational conversation already. So last important point. So the I is ultimately not an additional entity for which this presence happens, but simply this presence itself. So this I, this would be what I think Wittgenstein calls the metaphysical subject in the Tractatus. This is note that I is in quotes here. So this is not really a subject. I've called it the ontological ego. We've discussed that it's the presence of the world from a point of view of the empirical ego, and that is why one is tempted to use I in quotes to discuss it. But you could say that reality in some sense shines without a witness, or that the witness is given with the witnessed. So this whole witness metaphor is destabilized. The mere actuality of the phenomenal, right? The being of the phenomenal. And this is also the quality of the phenomenal. So this is the deep relationship between being and quality. And when I say quality, I mean not qualia, because these are internalized, fictional, psychical entities. I mean the sound of my voice right now in your ear. You could say the sensory character of the world, right? It is there. The red of the rose is there. The sound of the saxophone is there.